Hey team, hope you're well. Today I'm going to make a video going into depth regarding my perspective of whether it's a good decision to be buying a property in New Zealand as of 2026 when I'm making this video. So we're going to go through all of the details regarding cons and pros to consider if buying a property right now makes a lot of sense. I'm going to try to provide information that you probably wouldn't actually see from majority of like media outlets or other people maybe making videos regarding if it makes sense to buy a property in New Zealand. I'm going to go actually a lot more into detail about things I think are definitely worth considering and things you need to know about if you're going to be buying a property. So there will be probably quite a bit of things to cover in this video. It might be a little bit of a longer one, but I really think it's worth your while watching this because you probably will learn something new from it, I suspect. And something I want to start this video off actually with is going into detail regarding how property has performed in New Zealand for the last 10 years. It's probably likely if you're, watching my videos or watching this channel, you probably have known, we're kind of coming off this peak that we have for property prices in New Zealand in 2021. So I want to share a graph, just going into detail with this, that you should be able to see here. And basically, this is a graph related to the average property price in New Zealand, and something I actually wanted to figure out because this is something personally I've thought about a lot in the most recent month as well, is that majority of these prices that we're seeing that the market is down 10, 20, 30% since the peak in 2021 isn't actually adjusted for inflation. Like those metrics that you can see here, say in 2021, the average property price in New Zealand might have been $1,040,000, which is what this graph is saying from Claude here. And now the average property price is, $909,000. So that would reflect, I think roughly like a 15 to 20% drop in property prices over the last 5 years or so based on this graph. But this is obviously not taking into account all the inflation we've experienced as well, right? Like for example, the CPI data that I've got here from Claude is indicating that in 2022 alone, it was 7.2% in inflation, right? And this is not taking into account that inflation, right? It's just purely reflecting how property prices have moved and not taking into that data into account as well. So in actuality, I think that, it's probably fair to say the average property price in New Zealand is probably depreciate much closer to like 30 to 40% with that being considered, right? Like here I've got 7.2% in 2022. In 2023, it was 5.7%. If we think of that year-on-year inflation being taken into account, it's a much more significant drop than what has actually transpired. And I want to make this video today kind of going into depth of like other things you need to consider moving forward, right? Because we're in the present date now. Now you need to make a decision if it makes sense to be buying properties moving forward. I'm going to let you know what I'm doing, more so towards the end of the video, and just other things you need to consider on top of this if you're looking at maybe buying a property, because there's a lot of things to consider. So that's what we're going to cover today. So I've made a little bit of a list here. Now, just looking at this list, you probably are familiar with like maybe a few of these things to consider. And obviously, you probably are aware, with some things as to why maybe a purchase makes sense and doesn't make sense, right? But I'm going to give my thoughts a little bit more so further, like I've mentioned earlier in the video. So one thing that I personally think is a really big thing to consider as a con that a lot of people in New Zealand don't think about is the overhang of people that have bought properties in 2021. So what you'll find is say if we take the example of the average property price that Claude had generated in 2021 was $1,040,000. Now, for someone right now, I guess when they bought this property, maybe they bought with, say, a 10% deposit because the lending requirements when you were buying a property in 2021 were quite loose, and that's why property prices went up as much as they did during that short period of time. I guess from 2019 to 2021, there were solutions and products available where you could have low equity, similar to what is actually available now, but just the requirements in terms of what you needed to be approved for a lot of lending was a lot looser than what it is now too. But anyway, let's say the position, someone buying a property for $1,040,000, they would have likely had a loan of $936,000. But the problem now is that if we just take the nominal value of like what a property is worth now, $909,000, there is a difference between that. Now they're in a position where their property is actually worth less than what they owe to the bank. So they're in a very vulnerable position because say if they want to sell their property, right, for $909,000 for what it's actually worth, they would need to still repay back the bank where they got this mortgage through, right? So they would actually need to pay the difference between, these two figures back to the bank on top as well. And a lot of people aren't in that position because say, if you bought in 2021, you've had all of the repayments week to week for the last 5 years on this 936 loan, which is a lot, especially considering rates have gone up like they have. And that's, lead to a lot of grief for a lot of people over the last couple of years. But the thing is, people can't even necessarily sell if they want to. So say if prices even appreciate a little bit, say over the next few years, maybe prices go up, say like, let's say 5-10%. Maybe now, they might be in a position where their property is now actually worth, say, 970, and they might be in a position where they could actually clear their debt. But because they are now in a position to clear their debt, there might be an influx of people that are in the same position and they will go to sell their properties, right? Because right now, there's just a lot of people that actually genuinely can't sell their properties because of how they've bought in 2021. I recently was looking at a property in Auckland. It was a townhouse where there was a development of 38 units or 38 townhouses, and they were all bought off the plans, very similar specification, for $799,000. I had the opportunity to buy one of these townhouses that was bought in 2021 for $500,000. Like, this is a newly built property, guys. And this scenario came up because the person that developed this property actually went into receivership. So I was like, okay, like that could make sense. I didn't end up buying it, which I'm actually kind of regretting a little bit. Like, me and my partner have had that conversation of like, maybe we should have done it because it makes kind of a lot of sense for our scenario. Maybe I'll go into later, in regards to what I'm saying and what I'm doing for clients, if that's a good decision to be doing. But ultimately, that was a scenario that transpired, and it was because they were literally forced into selling, like they went into receivership or liquidation for that. But other people that bought in this complex, they might have a mortgage of like, say 650 to 700K. Maybe if they bought for 799, maybe they even have a mortgage higher than that. And one of the same townhouses in that development just offered 500K. So like, even if they wanted to sell, they can't. And that's a scenario I think a lot of people are in New Zealand that a lot of people actually don't consider, especially first-time buyers. And when I was first getting in the industry, it actually wasn't a consideration point at all. But I think just because there is going to be that overhang, especially if there is some positive sentiment around property, this is going to have a big conflict of, if prices are going to go up, that a lot of people don't actually think about. It's a really big consideration of mine. That is why it's kind of actually quite high up on my list. But there's other things to consider. This is just kind of scratching the iceberg of stuff. So there's a few more things to go through, but that is one thing to think about, that overhang of when people can actually sell their property. That's going to have some dictation on property prices. And that's definitely towards the con side of, it doesn't make sense to buy it because, prices might not necessarily go up because of that. Now, another thing is townhouse supply. This one, I probably don't need to spend too much time to. It's probably pretty self-explanatory if you're a Kiwi watching this video. There's been a lot of townhouses, right, that there's kind of like, probably an oversupply of them, which has probably a negative connotation towards property, right? If there's a big supply relative to demand, that is a negative sentiment towards, property prices appreciating. Probably don't need to go too much more into detail on that. Kind of goes without saying. Now, DTI, if you're unfamiliar with what DTI is, basically the Reserve Bank of New Zealand came out with this scheme, I guess, to sort of slow down people's eligibility to if they could borrow a fund. So it's called a debt to income ratio. So in 2021, reason why prices appreciated as much as they did is because the lending criteria wasn't as strict as now. So they said, look, so we don't have that, super large unsustainable growth in property. We're going to introduce something called a debt to income ratio, where if you're buying your own home, you can't borrow more than 6 times your income involved in an application. So for example, maybe if you're looking at buying a property and you make $100,000 per year and you say you're going to have a boarder paying $250 per week, that would mean that you have an annual income of $113,000. So even if you have very minimal expenses, this DTI is basically saying, even if you wanted to, because of this being implemented, you actually can't necessarily borrow anything more than $678,000. Whereas in 2020 and 2021, this didn't exist. So that might have enabled when lending requirements were a little bit less lenient, you could borrow more than this figure, right? And it actually might have been affordable for those people to borrow more funds because interest rates were a lot lower, which we will cover a little bit moving forward after this. But basically, that's a con towards property prices, right? If property prices are going to increase, obviously, you would want more less restrictions in terms of what people could borrow for prices to appreciate further. But now that's been introduced, it's technically a con in terms of prices appreciating. I actually think it's a good thing personally for it to be implemented. I wish it was in 2021 for those maybe more vulnerable people that bought then and didn't have that understanding. But just another thing to consider now that's been implemented if you weren't familiar already, and something that needs to go into your judgment if it makes sense to buy from my point of view at least. But it is ultimately a good thing from my point of view. Maybe you disagree, but find it hard for someone to say it's not a good thing, I guess. Anyway, we'll move on from that. So the next thing is just regarding the OCR and interest rates. So at the time of recording, there is expectation and sentiment that both the OCR and longer term interest rates to increase from where they are now. That basically means, at least in the short to medium term, that the cost of holding property might become more expensive, right? Like, for example, if you have an interest rate on your loan of 5% relative to, say, if it's 5.5% or 6%, it means the cost of you holding that property, or the cost of borrowing, is more expensive, and that has a negative sentiment around property. This is more so from a short to medium term point of view. It's forecasted as well. I actually have this interesting statistic that I'm going to share now on Polymarket. If you're unfamiliar with Polymarket, this is like a prediction market, and there's actually this sort of prediction where you can place a bet on, supposedly, of what the OCR is anticipated to do on the next announcement, which is April 7th when I'm recording this video. And apparently there's a 97% likelihood that there's going to be no change from the OCR on the 7th of April, which I find really interesting, because prior to me discovering this sort of resource, it's kind of hard to actually know and understand what the probability is of, one of these outcomes taking place. Like, you would think, at least from the time I'm making this video, from my point of view at least, is that there's probably a higher probability with where things are at that there's going to be an increase in the OCR. But now, because there's like a real-time live market where money can be made, this is forecasting that it's going to remain the same, and there's such a high probability for it, which I find really interesting. So anyway, there's some info on that, and I've recently just seen, because I have been following this quite actively as my line of work to understand rates and pass on feedback to my clients, obviously, is that as of the following OCR announcement, which will happen 6 weeks after April 7th, and it's on the 27th of May, is that it was scheduled to increase quite a bit, but I think maybe because there's not a lot of volume on these, there is a bit of turbulence. Like you can see here, if you were to say have a prediction that rates were to increase, there's a 32% probability, but you're actually getting shares or odds as if you're buying at 42%. So there's quite a big spread there. So maybe there's just not enough liquidity, I think is the term here for accuracy on this. But there is a bit more for this one because it's more upcoming. There's more volume on here. But anyway, that's something to consider, just a bit of a resource, just if you guys were interested in that. I figured I find it quite insightful personally. But anyway, that's something to consider. That's definitely a con moving forward, at least in the short to medium term. Now, another one, this is probably arguably the biggest one on the list. I have it number 5 down here, but it's probably the biggest one, and it's regarding immigration. So obviously, if there's more people moving to New Zealand, that's going to lead to more demand for housing, which leads to high value, most likely in pricing. Right now, I had found some data from Claude that I asked, and I think the record net immigration New Zealand had was 130,000 people, and that happened in 2023. And most recently, in 2025, I think the net inflow of migration was 11,000 people. So there's been like a huge decrease in, say, net immigration of people coming to New Zealand. If you're watching this video, you're probably very well aware a lot of Kiwis are moving to Australia, and that has a negative connotation on property prices appreciating if that immigration is at those levels. I think moving forward, based on my request to Claude to understand how much immigration is going to be happening over the next couple of years, there's probably an average between 30,000 to 50,000 people expected to arrive. But I guess that's pure speculation, right? It's hard to know. Probably dependent on maybe something that we're going to talk about regarding the election, if that is going to transpire. Like those are things it's hard to understand. But obviously, in recent times, because of that immigration being lower than what it traditionally has been, negative influence on property moving forward. And that's something to think about as well. Obviously, maybe looking at that data accurately if you're going to be buying a property, and also maybe the region specifically where you're going to be buying the property, is understanding the inflows of people, both leaving and coming into that region is really important to understand, I think, as well. So needs to be, something you consider and look into. Another con is regarding rates and insurance, and I guess other holding costs. So in recent times, especially in some areas like Wellington comes to mind, for example, rates and insurance year on year have gone up quite drastically, and that influences your holding costs if you own a property, right? So for example, I might be a little bit off with these numbers, but I know it's roughly around this, is that insurance and rates for holding a property, I think, have gone up, probably up about 10% year on year. So say if you bought a property in 2025, you might have been paying $2,000 a year for, your rates bill. Now all of a sudden it's become, 10% more expensive. Now you're paying $2,200 a year. And obviously if you're paying more in holding costs, and having that sort of increment of like 10% more than what you were paying before, it's going to have a negative connotation towards property prices being worth more moving forward. And again, from my point of view and all of the research I've done, that doesn't look like it's going to slow down, at least in the short term, moving forward. Maybe it will over the long term. Maybe things become more sustainable from a rates point of view. At least I'm trying to think of like some examples of how that transpired, but it's not coming to my head. But anyway, in the short term, that's something to consider. Now, another thing of I guess a con that I put in is just the election uncertainty. We don't know a lot of like policies that will have a positive or negative influence on properties moving forward. That's quite hard to speculate. I actually have got government as a pro moving forward, and I'm going to give my input on that. But I just think with the uncertainty, that's more so the con of things moving forward. Again, this is more of a short-term thing. We've got the election, I think it's in October at the end of the year, but that can definitely lead to, say, like potentially property prices being worth less in the short term. And then the other thing as well that I have recently sort of been thinking about is regarding kind of similar to the immigration thing is regarding the smaller regions in New Zealand. I know as a good example in Japan, which I don't know if this is actually a fair scenario, but in a lot of the smaller towns in Japan, they've experienced like complete collapse in terms of their property valuation because the smaller generation, the younger generation in those smaller towns have just been moving to big cities, and there's a huge influx of people leaving those towns to move to bigger cities, and there's not that demand for those housings in those small areas for that older generation. So they've experienced like extreme collapse in property value, and that means for me, actually personally, because I've recently bought a property in the Central North Island in a pretty small town, and also it kind of goes like with my ethos of my property investment strategy moving forward towards more cash flow orientated properties, is that over the long term, maybe the small regions could be affected by that. In New Zealand, similar like it has in Japan, if you think of those small towns of 10,000 people, are people actually going to be staying in your west coasts, like your Westports, your Greymouths, what are some other areas, maybe your more isolated areas like your Harwooders, or I don't know, those other towns of like 10,000 people or less. And also maybe like those kind of mid towns of maybe between 10,000 to 50,000 people, how are they going to hold up as well? I'm thinking of areas maybe like your Timaroos or your Gisbornes or your Wanganuis. Like, how are they going to hold up in all this? So maybe doing some more due diligence is going to be required if you're looking at buying a property in those areas, of how that's going to look long term. Maybe using some AI to get an understanding of like what your risks are of buying in the small regions. But just because of some things that have transpired overseas in other countries, that could be a con if you're looking to buy there, because of people probably leaving to get better opportunities just because of the exposure of everything we see online. The younger generation, especially in those small towns, they might just say, look, I want to do something here and move to a bigger area. So anyway, that's another thing to consider from a con point of view. But in terms of the bearishness, that's mainly the big things I'm considering in terms of if it makes sense to buy or not. We'll move on to the pros now, of things from a more bullish sentiment of if it makes sense to buy property in New Zealand moving forward. Now, first one I've got up here is government. So what I'm meaning by this is that basically, as a whole, New Zealand is kind of like, you've probably heard the saying before, is that our economy is basically just like, I'm trying to think of it word for word, but it's along the lines of like our economy is basically a housing market with things just like ticked around it, like regarding, butter, milk, all those, dairy products and wool and, our agriculture sector and everything. But it's pretty much just the housing market with other things, tied around it. And if property prices are going to depreciate in value, that has a huge negative effect on basically, yeah, like the government moving forward, right? The government is basically wanting house prices to appreciate because of all the, tax revenue it generates from, a variety of industries. Obviously, on like any construction that is done on property, from as of right now, with the current, tax structures that are set up with, GST, every single time new property is constructed, say it's, 600K or whatever it is, they're clipping the ticket 15% GST on all of that, right? That, adds a lot of, revenue to the government. Plus all of the, sectors surrounding it. Like for example, for me, I'm a mortgage advisor, right? If people are buying and transacting and buying properties and needing brokers, all that tax revenue that all the revenue I'm generating is going to the IRD because the property market is doing well. I guess for my line of work, I'm not necessarily dependent on the property market doing well, but that's just an example. Maybe if you think of like real estate agents, if they're selling a lot of property, transacting and doing all that stuff, again, I guess for them, it's not necessarily dependent on the property market doing well for a real estate agent to do well. But basically, like the government is wanting probably property prices to appreciate, or for there to be a very active market for them to continue making revenue. So that's something they want. And because of that sort of track record as well, kind of sinks quite well into this, is that because New Zealand has that foundation of, property prices appreciating and wanting a good property market, that does have some positive sentiment around over the long term. It probably will lead to properties appreciating more in value. If you think of like Australia and our economies, or just I guess our culture being very similar, you've probably noticed overseas Australian market has done quite well, and it's probably more so towards things like net immigration being really large for Australia right now. But another thing for them as to why property prices, I think, have appreciated quite well over there is because they're very much along the lines of this. They have a big track record of really wanting property to excel because they get a lot of revenue for it. And in Australia, they have, stamp duty. So any property transaction that's taking place, they're clipping the ticket maybe a little bit more and generating more revenue than what's happening in New Zealand. But ultimately, this is sort of something I'm thinking over the long term. New Zealand and Australia, they sort of want property to do and perform well. It might not necessarily be the best thing for New Zealand long term. I'm not saying that, but it's just more so like that's something I consider a con, is like they probably don't want to have like a huge collapse of property prices to stay in power as well. Like from people that are wanting to get elected, they might say again along the lines of like they are going to implement policies that are positive towards property, and that's sort of how our economy has been built on anyway. But anyway, that's something I wanted to cover as a pro. And I think before I go to this stuff, I might also talk regarding the tax environment as well, which is a bit of a pro, because I know in New Zealand, say compared to other countries, at least, like just regarding the example I just shared with Australia, stamp duty, again, that's a bit of a con, obviously, if you're transacting on a property in Australia. I don't actually know the percentage of stamp duty that goes on a property acquisition. I think it ranges from like 1.5% to 3%, I'm assuming. But in New Zealand, obviously, we don't have that. And that probably appeals actually to a lot of investors overseas. But it just means transacting from that point of view is actually a little bit easier because obviously, you don't have to, pay that surcharge, I guess, when transacting on property. And we also have a lot of pretty favorable tax incentives, I guess, being able to claim interest deductibility. We don't have negative gearing like there is in Australia. And I guess that's another con towards, buying property in Australia, because, I think the nature or the terminology used for how we do it in New Zealand is we ring fit. So you can't actually claim it against like your personal income is my understanding, but they're still pretty good from a global point of view. I think the tax incentives for investors, which is a positive sentiment to maybe property prices appreciating. So I've got that down here. Now, the other things as well in terms of pros, as well that you have is at your disposal, I guess, in terms of property prices appreciating is it is still technically, from my point of view, a buyer's market. There is still quite a lot of supply and options available for, say, people looking at buying property. There's a lot of stock and you have a lot of leverage to be able to negotiate, good terms and everything. And that's sort of a pro in the sense you might be able to pick up a property, 80, 70, 60 cents on the dollar and all those things. Construction costs, another one. I would say just with where pricing is now, like for example, for a recent property I bought in the Central North Island, I picked it up for $225,000. I'm pretty confident that for someone to rebuild this property, if you think of all the materials, labor costs, getting everything synced with all the council services, I don't see a way where a 90 square meter dwelling can be rebuilt for this price point. And I'm finding in the market right now with where property prices are, is that's very similar for a lot of different properties I'm looking at. Maybe in your bigger cities, the construction costs are a little bit less than what the property's actually worth, but in the smaller regions, for this to be rebuilt, that gives me a lot of confidence that the property I'm buying is actually of good value, because the actual rebuild cost of this is much more than what I'm actually purchasing the property for. And there's a lot more opportunities I'm seeing with that moving forward. And if I think of the long-term point of view as well, is with the geography of New Zealand, being obviously so remote, is this going to become cheaper over the long term or more expensive? I mean, personally, with all the information I have right now, I probably would say it's going to become more expensive, but that might not be the case with your 3D printing and all this advanced technology that we're experiencing in the 21st century. But hey, look, that's my point of view now of where things sit, and I think that's a bit of a pro in terms of like opportunities to find better deals because of this construction costs constraint. You might be able to pick up an existing property for less than what it costs to rebuild the property, which I consider a pro. Now, kind of touched on overseas investors a little bit, but another thing as well to think about more from a long-term point of view is, as of right now, the only people that can buy properties in New Zealand are New Zealanders, Australians, or Singaporeans, or if I think this has been a new thing that's introduced, and I actually don't know too much about it, but I think if you are not from these locations, you can actually buy a property in New Zealand for no less than $5 million. And I'm thinking like maybe in the short term, like this will stay the same. But there's also probably a very high probability to get some money, because we are in a deficit that they bring in the Americans, they bring in all the other people worldwide where they say, yeah, we need money, you can invest here, you can set up shop here for whatever reason. It might not happen, but I have the impression that it has a decent probability of happening. And that kind of leads me on to another thing as well, is this is sort of more so like an emotional or personal thing, but I think like this country we live in terms of like the longevity of it and being a desirable place to live, it's New Zealand at the end of the day. Like arguably, again, this is my personal opinion, it's probably the most beautiful and ideal location to live in the world. And I'm probably saying that more so on like a patriotic point of view, being a Kiwi myself. But like, if you're thinking from an overseas point of view, you'd like to think probably New Zealand is on a lot of people's wish list to be a part of, whether it's owning property or living here one day, and then everything going on overseas with the conflict. Like it's a pretty desirable place, I would say. Maybe Australia is in that conversation, and maybe some other countries as well. But New Zealand over the long term is always going to have that sentiment. So regardless of maybe like all of these things we've even considered in today's video, I think long term, when I think 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, which might be too far in advance to even think about, but I like to think it's going to be a very desirable location for people moving forward over the long term. Whether we have 5 million people still here like we do now, I think it's probably going to increase a lot. Obviously, that's dependent on a lot of these things, especially probably around like, what's happening from the government point of view, and maybe all the conflicts going on overseas. We don't know what the world's going to look like. But at the end of the day, if I think, New Zealand's a beautiful place to live, a lot of people are going to want to come here. And maybe because the net immigration isn't so high right now, it might change really drastically over the next 5-10 years. Maybe Australia has like, big shortage in immigration because of their government sentimental policies at the time, and then New Zealand gets a lot of that immigration, and that leads to huge demand in property prices. I don't know, might happen along the lines. This is obviously in the short term not so relevant, but I think over the long term that could lead to a lot of prices. So I think that's a bit of a pro, a bit of a yeah, I guess non-factual sort of argument around property prices appreciating, but it's my sentiment and something I think about as well. And another thing is of right now too, again, from my understanding from other, you know, just things to consider, maybe like looking at properties overseas in Australia and from seeing what other investments from a cash flow point of view look like. I think the yields in New Zealand are a lot better than they are overseas right now. But that could be an unfair thing to say, to be honest, because I know with where interest rates are right now in New Zealand, they are a little bit lower relative to Australia. But from my personal experience, I've been exposed to just like much better yields relative to, obviously purchase price and the rental income it can achieve relative to other things I'm hearing like overseas. Like it seems a lot better from a cash flow point of view. And it's especially good on those smaller regions. But then again, there's the long-term risk of those smaller regions not performing as well from a capital point of view from people leaving. So anyway, that could be pretty good. It probably doesn't necessarily lead to so much drastic property price appreciation of whether it makes sense to buy, but it could be good from a cash flow point of view, maybe for older people wanting to achieve those high yields because they can't get them, say, overseas. So I consider a bit of a pro and just another thing of consideration. So yeah, there's a bit of insight in terms of things you need to consider when buying, I guess. Now, in terms of what I'm doing moving forward and what I'm saying to clients, I think moving forward, the most important thing for you is obviously, whether you're buying in Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, smaller region, is you need to try to get as much data and information as you can about that specific area, right? So like if you're looking at buying in Gisborne or Tokoroa or Whangarei, you need to look at those things around like, are people going to be moving here? What's the government investing in these areas? Is there going to be a lot of inflow of people? Is there not? So getting that data is really important. And at the time of when you may be looking at buying, understanding that is really crucial. You actually might be watching this video in a year's time. I'm hoping with the videos I make on this channel, they have that sort of evergreen aspect of, it's still being relevant as time goes on. And, maybe there's a change in a lot of these things, but ultimately, I just think it's important to get as much data and do the due diligence up front for all of these things to consider if it's worthwhile doing. Another thing as well is obviously speaking with the right people regarding this potential property you're looking at buying and if it makes sense, right? You can speak with me and I can do an actual analysis for your property that you're looking at buying, right? I don't know if I mentioned earlier in this video, if you haven't seen my videos before, I'm a mortgage advisor, so I can help arrange lending and the best solution for finance if you're looking at buying a property. And I can also give you my judgment of if I think it makes sense, right? Like I can give you a lot of different insight, like kind of similar to like I have in this video, I guess, if you've got to this point. And you can probably see I care a lot about the service I provide and making sure my clients are well informed about what they're getting themselves into, right? Another thing as well, as of right now, is to where things are at. I think it's really important that you're just being very selective of the property you're buying, right? In the short term, it's probably, there's not a high probability that there's going to be exponential growth in property in New Zealand. I think that's pretty fair to say. Like when I search on, Claude and ChatGPT and I'm trying to forecast, what's the expected growth moving forward, they're pretty low numbers, especially compared to Australia. But over the long term, if you're looking at a longer time horizon like me, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, some of these things can come into play. And there's, some pretty good discounts that could be on offer here, but I think if you're able to buy a property, say, 80 cents or 70 cents on the dollar. So for example, if you're looking at buying a property for, 500K, and, you can actually pick it up for not 40,000, for $400,000. And then the income that $400,000 property is generating is covering all the debt obligations. That way you are quite protected, even if, say, the property market doesn't perform even at those numbers I said, between like 2 to 5% year on year from here on out. So being selective of what you're buying, I think, is really critical. I think if you're just going to be buying a property for 500K, it's worth 500K, and you're going to be having to top up the mortgage week on week, that might not be the most educated decision. Maybe your funds or borrowing ability might be best off being put somewhere else, or if not at all, So again, something I could analyze for you. Shameless plug if you want to work with me, but those are things to consider I guess, and what I'm saying to my clients. So ultimately, yeah, that's what I'm trying to do too. Like I recently bought a property for 225. It is in a really small town. Like the town is more of like a tourist town in the central North Island, and it has kind of like a residing population of actually only around 1,000 people. My dad grew up there, for a bit of context as well. And I'd say, at the time of recording, I should probably look at this after this video actually, is the bank valuation sitting around this value. And again, when I went through like the replacement value to reconstruct this dwelling, it's going to be way more than 225. It's probably reflective more so of this. And in buying this property, there's two primary reasons why I bought it. And also this should be the kind of reason for buying any property as well, is I don't necessarily forecast much capital growth, right? I don't think there's going to be a big influx of people moving to this town necessarily, even though I do think it's, pretty beautiful, but it is, quite a small and remote area. But because I bought it on a discount, I can potentially recycle the bank valuation to extract more money to potentially buy another property again, giving me some flexibility. So that was a key reason why I ended up buying the property, but also the income that this property is going to likely achieve for me is $450 per week, which would cover all of my debt obligations for this property too. So from my point of view, even though that, maybe there's not so much confidence in the property market moving forward, this makes sense for me to buy with my position right now and, everything I have at my disposal with the information I have, So yeah, that's my point of view for it. And then maybe moving forward, as I maybe look to buy maybe another property, it might not be in such a small town. Maybe it'll be in a bigger town, right? To spread my risk and reduce my exposure of those smaller areas, so I'm not succumb to maybe what's going on in Japan. It might not necessarily happen here, but it's just something I'm considering. But anyway, I think that's pretty much all I wanted to cover today, guys. Again, obviously a bit more of a longer one, but I'll leave all of my stuff in the description if you want to reach out to me and work with me, guys. And if you want to watch some more of my videos, maybe they can be helpful, and I'll leave them on the screen for you. Cheers.